Thank you for joining Progenesis Academy today. I'm Dr. Fernanda Pacheco. I'm Director of Medical Affairs at Progenesis. And we are here today for one more webinar of Progenesis Academy, which is a nonprofit educational platform founded by Dr. Nabil Arash, CEO and founder of
that? In other words, what's the effect of these exogenous gonadotropins on oocyte competence? Are we forcing follicles to develop? And, so how does this contribute to the overall embryo health? And these were really never addressed until we had the presence of time-lapse incubators. And then now with the advent of AI, we never really were able to address what happens when we stimulate secondary follicles and get them to go all the way to the finish line to get them retrieved. And so now with time-lapse, we're really in this neat position to really be able to see, for example, when there's time to PN appearance, when the embryo cleaves to the 2-cell stage, and so on all the way around. And so then if you combine AI then with, if you combine AI along with time-lapse and morphokinetics, you can really see here that we're collecting a lot of data from these embryos. Not only are we collecting the time spans between cleavages and things like that, but we're measuring like the size of the blastomeres, the orientations of the blastomeres to each other. We're looking at cavitation. We're looking at how many times the embryo expands and contracts, and we're even looking at the size of the inner cell mass. So all of this information goes into the cloud, and AI, develops a really neat score, which is a composite of all of this information. Its results, it's called embryo quality score. And so for the next several minutes, we're going to talk about embryo quality scores. And so, I have this slide up there to remind us that, for the old people like myself, we used to take the dishes out 1 or 2 times a day to collect data. Well, now think about it. You don't even have to take your embryos out of the incubator. And there's a lot of AI platforms that are collecting up to 2.5 billion data points on a single embryo. And that's just an amazing amount of data that can now be correlated with, did it become a blastocyst? Was it a genetically normal blastocyst? If so, did it result in a baby? So what I'm going to touch on now is how AI and embryo development really have worked together and have really kind of unraveled some of the myths that we have about how embryos develop. And some of you may say, well, let's just do embryo biopsy. Well, my argument is that euploidy, the ploidy status is insufficient for viability because morphology and morphokinetics are really important. And the reasons why are, for example, in blastocyst morphology, we can have meiotic or mitotic errors that occur, and these do not, then they don't affect genes that are critical for blastulation. From a metabolic aspect, metabolism can occur too fast, and therefore we utilize all of our resources, which can affect embryo development. It can result in either too slow or too fast. And this is a concept that Henry Leese many years ago discussed. You can have errors in genetic instruction for future embryo development. And then there can be insufficient chromosomal or insufficient chromosomal proteins that are present there to try to help all the embryos develop. So if we get into some data that we have recently, we can see here that really we have the impact here. We're looking at the impact of resulting morphokinetics on resulting embryo quality score. That's what EQ is. And if we look at this bar graph, we look at all the different time intervals that we've associated now that are clinically relevant, for example, time to PN. And really what this slide shows is that all of the morphokinetic events contribute to the embryo quality score. So now AI is giving us a composite score that's based upon how fast the embryo divided. And what we did here is we applied statistics to see what was the weighted values of each event. And we can see that every event contributes positively to this sum score. But we can see that critical events like 7 to 8 cell stage, and then especially from morula onward, that these are events that are most correlated with embryo quality score. So again, for the first time now, things that we've been thinking about and a lot of pioneers have written about are that how the embryo develops and the rate that the embryo develops is very important. Now we're able to measure these, to minutes, and we can calculate if, for example, the embryo cleaving from a 2-cell to a 4-cell occurs within its proper time, or when an embryo, for example, ends cavitation. And so then the other things that we're able to do now, and we've often seen this clinically in the laboratory, those of you who really think about this, is that often our older patients tend to have more embryos available for biopsy on day 6 or even day 7. And the reasons for that are now we're able to see with AI that as AI increases, the time to expanded blastocysts also increases. For example, if we look at hours, a woman who's under 35 years of age, time to blastulation, expanded blastulation, is 114 hours compared to a 42-year-old, which is 128. And we can also see that the EQ scores of these resulting patients are impacted. And so that's why often the quality of these embryos from these older patients isn't the same as their 35-year-old counterparts. But we can clearly see here that the effect of age is prevalent and evident in, especially during the period of blastocyst formation. And so if you then look at what about morphokinetics intervals and blastocyst ploidy. This is from a Jerry Cilia, many of you know. This is looking at different time parameters and looking at with optimal morphokinetics and ploidy. And again, we're finding that there are associations between ploidy and these various morphokinetic events. So we're looking at cell cycle 2. We can see embryos that occur within the optimal time. 75% of those are euploid versus 63% are not, that occur outside of these windows. And you can clearly see a pattern that embryos that complete their cell cycles within these time intervals are much more likely to be euploid than their counterparts. And why is this important? Well, because I think that we could start to utilize this data to actually start to do transfers without having to do embryo biopsies. We may be able to move to a point where, say, patients under the age of 35 with embryos that have good developmental history, more than likely they're euploid, so we could reduce the need, to do, things like biopsies and having to ship off these cells. If we also then look at very specific embryo quality scores, we can see that in this study here that we had almost a 58% ploidy rate when the embryo mean time for expanded blastocyst was 115 hours. But when we went outside of that critical time period of 115 hours, we see that the aneuploidy rate jumped up quite a bit. So we can see that embryos that fall outside of critical time periods, this is very reflective of their ploidy status. And if we look at biopsy rates, then by EQ scores, by embryo quality scores, we can also see that the percentage of embryos that are utilized in the laboratory have higher EQ scores than ones that are not. And the reason why this is important is it has a lot of use in the laboratory. It can help us determine, when are we going to have embryos to biopsy in the laboratory. It helps us a lot from a time management perspective. But even more so, it can help us a lot in a quality control aspect. And that is that if embryos are dividing in your laboratory within the given time periods and are resulting in high EQ scores, then more than likely you have optimal embryo culture conditions, and more than likely you're going to utilize much more embryos than those embryos that are either growing slowly or too quickly. And so then if we look at though how does this EQ score, embryo quality score, relate to pregnancy? And this to me, I think, is really fascinating. And we have a publication with our colleagues from Spain that's going to be coming out shortly. And what we found with them was for every 1 unit in an embryo quality score, the odds of achieving a live birth increased by about 18.5%. And so for once now, we have an objective enough embryo quality score, unlike, a more subjective score that's based on the appearance of the embryo. We can actually correlate what an embryo quality score as determined by AI and how it's going to impact pregnancies. So now we're starting to get somewhere where now we can really look at like how best to utilize embryos, which embryos should we transfer first. I mean, all of this information can be very helpful and useful in IVF clinics in trying to manage what we do with all these embryos. Because if you think about it, even in cases where we don't biopsy the embryos, we freeze them all. When we go to thaw them, we don't take history into account. We just take a Gardner score into account. But that doesn't really tell us much about, the quality of the embryo. If we then look at ongoing pregnancy rates in this group in Spain, we can see that when the EQ score was higher, that the regression model also showed that there was an increase in pregnancy rates here as well. And again, these scores are subtle, which indicate that the difference between those embryos that result in a pregnancy and not a pregnancy is very, very subtle, often impossible to detect with the naked eye. So this is a transfer of untested embryos. And so here we were able to use the subtleties of the embryo quality score, to determine which embryos would implant and not. So again, looking at some of the blastulation and utilization scores, we saw some of the slides earlier, but this is a slide again from a clinic here in California, and you can see that no matter as long as embryos are dividing during their cell cycle events, the impact of these morphokinetic intervals on blastocyst utilization is really quite profound. In other words, embryos that do not cleave or have 2PN appearance or go to the 4-cell or 5-cell stage, all of these timed intervals are very critical in indicating how many of these blastocysts are going to utilize. And so this data overall lets us understand that the morphokinetic events are very indicative of how many of these blastocysts that we generate in our laboratory are going to be utilized. And this is data that we generate routinely with AI that would be impossible to get otherwise. So then we've talked about how embryo development impacts pregnancy rates, how embryo development impacts utilization rates. But what about in these countries like here in the United States where we biopsy virtually every embryo? How can AI help us with this? Because remember, I remember when we first started to do embryo biopsy, I remember talking with Dr. Mounet about this, thinking, we're going to hit it out of the park. Now that we can look at all of the chromosomes, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be achieving, 80%, 90% take-home baby rates, given we're never going to be able to solve for the uterine factors, but we should have solved for all of the issues with the embryos. And unfortunately, that's not been the case. This is a study that we did with our dear friend Kathy Miller. And what this shows us is the concept of optimal embryo development as it's applied to PGT. So these were all high quality, good looking blastocysts, at least 4 expanded on a Gardner score. And we can see what the pregnancy rates are and ongoing pregnancy rates are when these embryos are cleaving within their optimal rates. So again, this is only euploid embryos. So for example, those embryos where time to start of blastulation to end of blastulation occurred outside of the optimal window, we could see that there was a 53% pregnancy rate in those cases compared to 64%. And you can see, for example, if the time period between 4-cell to 8-cell was not optimal, then again, the pregnancy rates with these euploid embryos, would drop from 63% to 46%. And that pattern exists all the way across all of these morphokinetic events and cell cycle divisions, which then gave us this concept of this, that basically what this tells us is that, if we look at the margin of this graph here, we can see that morphologically, euploid embryos can develop within a really wide tolerance of morphokinetic events. However, if these events occur too far on the outside, we see that even though these embryos are good looking and they're euploid, none of them resulted in a live birth. Those embryos that existed that were within this, what we call outside live birth, we still got pregnancies, but we had higher miscarriage rates and we did not see the delivery rates that we wanted. The embryos that consistently resulted in really high ongoing pregnancy rates with lower miscarriage rates were those embryos that had a consistent optimal development during their entire pre-implantation development. And so this data is an indication that, yes, nucleic maturation is important, but cytoplasmic contribution to these embryos is equally as important, because this is the first time now that we're really able to show the impact of the cytoplasmic contribution on those embryos that have been proven to be euploid. And so here, we also can look at the morphokinetic events on Dr. Cilia's here. We see that the same effect here of ploidy on his data. And if we look at prediction of live births using blinded assays, we found that and this was again in an IVF clinic in the United States, when the embryologists were blinded to the embryo quality score and just selected purely based on morphology, we can see that the pregnancy rates with really high quality euploid embryos that cleaved within the optimal range had a 72% ongoing pregnancy rate compared to 48% for euploid embryos that were high quality, but had developed suboptimally, that had been outside of the optimal ranges. So we can see that clearly cytoplasm is contributing here to those embryos. So this whole concept of suboptimal, optimal development in ploidy embryos is now a reoccurring theme. And again, for the first time now, we're really able to show that there is a loose correlate. There is a correlation between cytoplasmic contribution and ongoing pregnancy. Well, what about AI for oocytes? Because this is really an important area, and it's the reason why it's important is that this was a study that was done several years ago by our good friend Dr. Barry Baer from Stanford, and he had his embryologists look at what they would predict blastulation to be based on the morphology. And basically, we can see that within these embryologists, that the ability to pick which embryo was going to become a blastocyst or not was less sensitive than chance. It was less accurate than flipping a coin. And we all know, those of us that work in the laboratory, that grading blastocysts is very subjective, but grading oocytes is even more subjective, because we simply don't have a lot of markers there that help us bear the fruit of, is this a really good looking embryo or is this an ugly oocyte? And so why is this important? Because For example, if you're trying to determine with patients, how many egg retrievals do we need to do? Should you do more? Should you do less? Is one egg retrieval good? And then also to reassure patients, on trying to manage patients, especially patients that have been through multiple IVF cycles. If we can apply AI immediately to their oocytes, it provides a level of reassurance, and it also helps us manage patient care. We can set the patient up exactly the way they need to be. But by also knowing this data, it allows us to personalize clinical strategy. So for example, if we know the follicular stimulation dynamics of a certain patient and we can change the gonadotrophin dosages or the length of days and compare to previous AI scores, we can see if these exogenous gonadotropins and different strategies are actually improving the AI score, the AI.
Hello. I think Dr. Klaus lost his connection. So in the meantime, I invite you to elaborate your questions, comments, and send us via chat or on the Q&A tab. And I hope that Dr. Klaus can come back soon. Thomas is helping me here. Thomas, can you contact Dr. Klaus to see what happened?
Yeah, I'm gonna reach out to him and then I'll let you know. It should be a technical issue.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, everyone, for this issue. I hope we can solve as soon as possible. And I invite you to write on the chat if you are an embryologist, you work for AI, you are an engineer, you are a doctor. Please tell me your position here on the chat. I'll be glad to know our audience. I also invite all of you to attend GENES. The GENES conference is going to be in Coronado, California, from May 29th to the 31st. Dr. Klaus Wiemer will be one of our speakers. He will be talking about AI and embryo selection. Today, I asked Dr. Wiemer to give more like a broad panorama.
Can you hear me now?
AI. Yeah, Dr. Klaus. I'm glad you are back.
Awesome. Are you able to see my screen?
No, not now. Not yet.
Okay. Hang on a second. What the heck happened? Technology, where are you? Why aren't you my friend? Okay, hang on just a second. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay, how about, are we good?
Yeah, but if you want to put in the slideshow, remember that draw in your bottom right. Yeah, this one.
Yeah. Is it in slideshow?
It didn't change yet. Yeah, Now it is.
Okay. All right, I'm really sorry about that.
No problem, no problem. It happens.
I saw an error, like all of a sudden I got this error message from WebEx, like we're trying to reconnect.
Oh,
Um, so anyways, let me see. I don't want to use up too much time here. So we were basically about right here, I believe. So we were really talking about how basically, human limitation for picking eggs is really, really low. And this kind of shows you right here a listing of, like, for example, the literature says that abnormal zona occurs about 4% of the time, and then smooth endoplasmic reticulum occurs 1% of the time. They say that's clinically relevant, but yet all these embryos make blastocysts. So we really need a way to grade oocytes. And so there's some really amazing AI platforms. There's two basic types. There's type that take a still image and then study the pixelated pictures. And then there's others where they use a time-lapse incubator where the camera kind of takes an image all the way up and down through the incubator. And so that really helps a lot. And so you can see, for example, these eggs all look the same, but yet, only the two on the right were able to form a blastocyst. And to be honest with you, when I play games with my friends, none of them are able to pick out which one of these becomes a blast or not. It's like Barry Bear says, it's like choosing. And so basically, we've got some data now showing that when we've got high AI scores, that, blastocyst development can be very high in these groups. And this has been really helpful because this is data that comes from a clinic that does a lot of frozen thawed donor eggs. And so they're able to do AI of the oocytes right away. And they're able to look internally, like we can manage the patient well. So for example, if the patient has high scores, we know that we're going to get high blastocyst development. And so this information has become really helpful, for a multitude of reasons. The area that I'm most excited about is applying AI to quality control and KPI monitoring. And the reason why that is that we collect all this information right now manually, and you can see down here all the different things that people look at, and we put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then we've got to make sure it's done right. And by the time we've gotten all of this done, whatever product we theoretically had brought into the lab has already run its course, and we're on the next lot of plasticware before we even determine that, plastic lot XYZ had an influence on the embryos. And so now with AI, because you're looking at a time lapse, you have a predictive capability. So what you can do is look at all of your rates, for example, and this is just some rates that I pulled up from a clinic here. We can look at degeneration rates, we can look at overall blast rates, and all of these are snapshots that you can look at any time. You can break this down into weeks or days, depending on how big your clinic is. And you can really then start to hone in on why, for example, did my day 2 development drop so much here in October? And it makes troubleshooting become much easier. So what's happened is that, so in other words, instead of having to write all of this information down from day 1 to day 7, all of the information, it moves directly is collected, and real time you're able to look at all of this data in a real-time manner. So before AI, we used to spend a day inputting all of this information, and we wanted to see how it impacted. And then a lot of times these non-conformances would go undetected, and it was impossible to compare between providers and centers. And this, I think, is really important now with these huge IVF networks where the lab director might live in California but directs labs in Texas, for example. Now you can log on and you can look at, how are my my ESCO incubators doing compared to my Jerry incubators? How are my 35-year-olds? Or, often we see things in the laboratory and we think that there's something wrong when the reality of it is there isn't anything wrong. It just may be patient care, maybe the quality of the patients that are going through at that point in time. So it really helps you figure out what's something you should clearly be fearful of versus just, this is just a rough patch with patients that are going through right now treatment. And so where also this is really helpful is in blastocyst utilization, these kind of KPIs. One clinic that we were working with, as you can see here, the percent euploids embryos that were in all of the embryos that were biopsied and not biopsied. You could see, for example, that they were only biopsying a total of 18% of their embryos. So therefore, 76, a large percentage of these embryos were not being biopsied, yet 24% of those, although they morphologically didn't look beautiful, they still had high quality scores. So when they started to biopsy these embryos with high quality EQ scores, we actually found that the euploid rates, despite their morphology, was quite high. So again, we can use these scores to kind of help us determine this. And this is, part of a KPI dashboard that can really help us a lot in the laboratory. And then one of the things that I think is really important that a lab directors really like a lot is the ability to monitor this. So for example, let's say you want a blastocyst development rate of 65%. That's what you want across board. And you want to look at all your age groups and you want to look at all your clinics. Well, that's really easy to look at. And what you can do is you can see, like, for example, what the fertilization rates were during that time and things like that. And you'll be able to look at these variables that we input in the laboratory. So for example, here we brought in maintenance of incubators. During this time, there were changes in culture media. So you can clearly look on an XY axis. You can actually look at cleavage rates and developmental rates and see how the products that you bring into your laboratory or how certain technicians are doing, embryologists are doing in the laboratory, how they impact outcomes as well. And this is data that you get within about 48 hours. So first of all, I want to apologize for the glitch. I certainly hope it wasn't something that I did, but I hope that you got something out of this. But a few words, final words, is that, I think AI has many applications for embryo selection in the lab, and that there's many different platforms that exist. And I think it's great that there's all these different AI companies that are doing this. In time-lapse and morphokinetics, so I do think pick up the subtle morphological characteristics that we weren't able to see. And we always had an idea that they would impact implantation, but now we can actually quantify the effect of certain morphokinetic events. And the data indicates that rate of blastocyst development. It might be an indirect measurement of cytoplasmic health and contributions. And I think this is a tool that might be useful for further selection of euploid embryos. And the application of AI for oocyte evaluation has many applications. And then time-lapse based AI has many applications for measuring KPIs and improving quality control. And this is an area that I'm really working a lot in right now, is trying to develop, the ultimate quality control system, for the laboratory, so that laboratory directors, regardless of where you are, will constantly know that your embryos are developing and dividing at their optimal rates, and allow you a platform to see, how the introduction of products, staff, physicians, everything is impacting embryo quality. So on that note, I will leave you there, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. We have around 50 attendees, and I already got some questions, okay? So the first question, any insights on low mosaic embryos and what AI is revealing now? Level of accuracy, positive outcomes. Thank you, Maya or Maja. Sorry for the mispronunciation.
Don't worry, Maja. Thank you for the question. Actually, I'm looking at some data right now from a large clinic set network that we work with, and we're actually finding embryos that have whole chromosome losses have different morphokinetic events, or embryos that have whole chromosome gains also have different morphokinetic events. However, we're finding embryos that are mosaic, that these embryos do not have different morphokinetic events. And that really makes sense because if you think about the definition of mosaicism, you know, we don't have enough affected cells within the embryo as a whole to really impact the cellular divisions. Whereas when we have, say, a trisomy or a monosomy embryo, where we're missing a whole segment or whole chromosome or loss or a gain, this is impacting the embryo to such an extent that it's exhibited in its morphokinetic events.
That's great. Dr. Klaus, I have a question for you. So you've been working with AI and implementing AI in labs in the US and globally. So what are the challenges you've been facing to implement AI in IVF clinics?
You know, it really depends on the continent. In Europe and in Latin America, AI has been embraced really well. And that's principally because the use of time-lapse incubators is not such a foreign concept. Whereas in the United States, you know, the reintroduction of time-lapse incubators has been really hard. And I think part of it is because when time-lapse incubators were first introduced to the United States, it was kind of sold as an add-on, that it was really going to do all kinds of stuff. And it turns out that it didn't really do anything. And so therefore, you know, the way we as Americans have evolved are that, well, we've done just fine without time lapse and AI, and we biopsy everything. So why is this important? But we're seeing a change now in the mentality of people. We're seeing, for example, most clinics that switch to to time lapse, see anywhere from an 8 to an 11% increase in blastocyst development. They love the fact that they don't have to take their embryos out of the incubators anymore. And now the value of that is becoming more and more evident. But I think it was just the introduction of time-lapse incubators back into the States was really a huge challenge.
Are you seeing more implementation of time-lapse incubators here in the US now?
Oh yeah. We're seeing a lot more incubators now that are time-lapse incubators being used now in the States. And especially because the interest now is because you can do so much more with them. Now with the integration of electronic medical records, EMRs, and the ability to integrate the data from a time lapse with a patient's particular chart, and being able to now download all that information from the EmbryoScope, for example, into the chart, that saves many, many hours. Because again, these are, they're sophisticated incubators. They have, servers associated with them and things like that. So I think we're starting to see that the concept is that there's so much data that can be collected in a time-lapse incubator, and with appropriate software and connectivity, that this incubator can now be used to disseminate information, via the time lapse back to the EMR and things like that.
Awesome. And in your experience, since I I learned that you are interested in the impact of oocyte stimulation in oocyte and embryo quality. What are your insights regards ovarian stimulation?
Well, that's a great question. So some of the data that we've looked at is that, for example, all of us as embryologists know that if the follicular stimulation is too aggressive, if it goes too quickly, that the quality of the oocyte is not as good. But we've had a very hard time quantifying that. And now through AI, we're clearly able to see that the overuse of medications where the patient does not have the proper amount of time to undergo follicular stimulation, that it's reflected in the AI score. And then that directly relates to the blastocyst. At the same time, the AI score is also helping us kind of optimize patients a little bit. So for example, if we have a patient that comes through an IVF clinic and her antral follicle count is really, really high, let's say because of the fear of hyperstimulation, we use too little medication, then the resulting oocytes that we get from that patient are typically not very good. And AI will often tell us exactly like, look, we got 30 eggs from you, but only 10 of them had a good AI score. So what we're going to do is change the follicular stimulation and try something different. And then now all of a sudden we're saying instead of, we may get 40 oocytes, we may get a few more oocytes, but the follicular stimulation was a little bit longer. We were able to adjust the medications appropriately. And then we see that the AI scores, rise appropriately. So now the physicians have, a concrete marker with, length of days, AI score, amount of medication, AI score, instead of like, no, the eggs didn't look very good, or when I did ICSI on them, they broke, or things like that. Now we've got some real information that we can, that's relatable.
And when we talk about length of stimulation, is the cohort like 10 days? Would you
Yes.
say that?
What
About
we're finding
days?
is that somewhere around 11 to 13 days of follicular stimulation is typically optimal. We're also finding that in certain patients that the use of actual birth control pills during the beginning of the follicular stimulation actually improves the AI score in some of these cases.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, to level the size of the follicles, right?
Exactly.
Great, great. So any more questions from the audience? They are shy. But I have received some questions when we were announcing the webinar.
Okay.
So how reliable is AI in assessing morphokinetics compared to experienced embryologists?
Oh, I think AI has got most embryologists beat hands down. I think it can assist embryologists. In other words, where AI works really, really well is when you're a well-trained embryologist and you understand to look at an embryo and understand the subtle characteristics that give that embryo that warm, fuzzy feeling that all of us as embryologists get when we look at the perfect embryo. But now you can look at the morphokinetic events that make up that embryo, and that data can reassure you that you're picking the right embryo to thaw. So I think what AI does is it's not here to replace an embryologist, but it's rather here to help you, to reassure that the selections that you're making are indeed the right ones. And it can be used quite often to confirm, for example, why you would choose a certain embryo over another. I think it helps a lot with when embryologists are talking to patients, if you can show them, because patients read Google all the time. They go, well, why did you choose a 4AA over a 5AA? A 5AA must be better. And if you can sit down and explain to the patient, you know, I chose the 4AA, it's not as expanded when I did the biopsy and the freeze, but I chose this one because the morphokinetic events that led to this 4AA were much more optimal than the morphokinetic events that led to the 5AA.
Great. And Dr. Klaus, what's your opinion? Do you think that AI in embryo development can overcome PGTA, or would you recommend the association or more a non-invasive approach using AI with a non-invasive PGT? What are your thoughts about these topics?
You know, I really think that if we could get away from doing as much embryo biopsy as possible, you know, and I don't mean as possible, but in certain cases, you know, I think that would help the industry overall. I think that what we're learning is that embryos that have optimal morphokinetic events are more likely to be euploid, like in the ranges of like 80%, things like that. So one has to question, once the body of evidence builds up and we have, you know, thousands of embryos that have undergone AI and embryo transfer results, and we're just not there yet. I think once we have data like that, that body of evidence will then be clearly, we can then use that to be more careful and selective of what embryos do we really want to do embryo biopsy on. You know, maybe not all of the embryos have to have biopsy. I think what's going to happen over time is that we're going to see, you know, things like metabolomics move into this field. And I'm a big believer that, you know, a combination of PGT, metabolomics, and AI will ultimately lead to, you know, us finding the embryo that's the very best, where we may use AI for only certain cases, or a combination of AI with metabolomics, you know, in younger patients. And so also, you know, I also think that, you know, in certain cases, it'll also help us determine like who really does need embryo biopsy. So for example, embryos that have lots of developmental rates that occur outside of the optimal ranges, in my opinion, those are the embryos that are most likely that need embryo biopsy. You know, an embryo that develops in its optimal ranges, you know, unless you're doing something like, say, gender selection or disease, looking at certain diseases and things like that, or a history of miscarriages, then I do think that we could probably do transfers, and we could even do some fresh transfers. I mean, there's no reason why, you know, we always freeze all these embryos. You know, I mean, for years we would just add some progesterone and do a transfer instead of having the patient come back and spend another, you know, anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500, you know, to do a frozen thawed cycle.
That's awesome. And how do you see the future of IVF and the AI automation in 5 years from now?
Oh man, I think in 5 years I will not be doing embryology, but I do think in 5 years what we're going to be seeing is a lot of automation in the laboratory. I think dishes, embryo culture dishes will be one of the first things that we see that's developed, you know, that's automated. I think things like egg retrievals will become automated very quickly. So I think within 5 years, we'll see automation starting to occur in laboratories.
Okay, and the last question, okay, because we are already completing 1 hour of webinar. So how do we ensure transparency in AI algorithms used in embryo selection? And should the patients be informed when AI plays a role? Yeah, in general.
Oh yeah, I think I think in general, yes. I mean, I think we as an industry have been super transparent, almost to a fault. You know, like my mom used to say, "Do you always really want to know how the sausage is made?" So but we've been super transparent in our field. To the point where it leads to litigious decisions. I think AI is just going to add transparency to that because patients want to know what's going on in the lab. Patients even want to see their embryos develop, on their phones. And I think AI will provide a platform so that patients can see how their embryos develop. They can see why these embryos were biopsied more than just an embryo grade. Because again, a lot of the AI companies have developed these really neat, based on red light, red, green, yellow, embryos all exist in this green area means that they grew well, whereas if there's some in the yellow, that means poorly. So I think we'll be able to bring a lot of complex topics in embryology down to a level that the patient can understand. And I think that'll just help the industry overall and take away some of these misgivings that exist today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I said that it was the last question, but from the audience, if you want to write any comment, questions, please feel free to do it. And in the meantime, I will call Thomas. He has some announcements to do.
Wonderful. Well, big thank you to Klaus and to everyone who came to today's webinar. It was excellent, and it's also the beginning of our new webinar series. So every other week, we'll be bringing on a speaker from Genes to participate in a topic related to what they'll be talking about at Genes as we get ready for our conference. A couple follow-ups I just want to do is you guys will be receiving an email from Simple Cert that will have your certificate from Progenesis Academy. In that email, you will also be receiving a discount code to register for Genes in person. This will be a 50% off discount and will be issued to all Progenesis Academy attendees. So I'm on the website here. If you just go to registration and then attendees registration, fill out the registration form and then put promo code Academy. You'll be able to get that 50% off. And then just for anyone that doesn't know, we have a Genes conference at the end of May, May 29th through the 31st. It'll be featuring speakers like Klaus. We have Jacques Cohen and a lot of incredible renowned speakers within the industry, which you can also find on our website. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing our next webinar in the next few days, and it'll be one of our Genes speakers. But again, thank you all for coming to today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you guys again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. And just to complement, you are going to receive a certificate of this webinar, and you can claim for ABB credits, okay? At Genes, the same will happen. Last year, we was approved, and we are waiting for the approval for this year. And I will announce the next webinar. It's going to be on ovarian stimulation insights with Dr. Alexander Klaus, who is also a speaker at Genes. And I want to thank you, everybody. I received a couple of messages congratulating Dr. Klaus and also saying thank you for me, for Dr. Klaus, for Thomas too. So thank you very much for your participation. Dr. Klaus, any last words you want to say?
Thanks very much to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in San Diego. I got to tell you, I go to lots and lots of meetings, and this is one of my favorite meetings because it's not very big. It's in an amazing place, and we all interact with each other really, really well. And we know, it's not like going to ASRM where you're just running from room to room and you never have a chance to actually talk to the speakers. There's tons of opportunity to converse with everybody, and you're going to learn everything about embryology, to endocrinology, and all of this I think is important, for continuing education, not just sitting in one room and listening to everything say about AI or just PGT, but rather you're going to hear about everything. It makes you a well-rounded person. And I think this is a good conference where that avenue occurs. So I'm glad and happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. Yes, I agree with you. I think the small environment and the chance of great networking is the highlight of Genes.
And hanging out on a boat having cocktails at the end of that's not so bad either.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Right. And this year the boat will be picking us up right from the hotel, so that's an added perk of joining Gene's conference this year. So everything's going to be catered a little bit smoothly this year. So we're excited to have everyone there, and look forward to networking with everyone.
Yeah, we'll see everybody soon. All the best.
See you. Bye bye. All the best. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Good evening. Bye bye.
Bye.